So welcome everybody, welcome back to our second webinar. Before we start, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respects to our elders past, present and future. And of course, once again, I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country. And we shall shortly begin the slides, but first of all, I would just like to ask if anybody would like to share how they went with any work you did on the motifs over the previous 2 weeks.
Constance here, I would just like to say how the evening that we had the webinar and did the artwork, here it's night time and it's dark. I'm just using lamps. And I thought the chalk painting was okay. But in the morning, when I saw the morning light on it, it just was amazing. The change in colors. The colors were so beautiful in the morning light, and it just changed my whole feeling of the painting, of the work. Yeah.
Perhaps it was you that changed rather than the painting.
Perhaps the morning light, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Constance. Anybody else? You don't have to, of course, but I just thought if anybody did have something they would like to share.
Oh, I just wanted to share, Fiona, that I actually couldn't put down, but I could imagine the tree of paradise and that whole sort of picture. But I didn't want to put it down, but I've actually worked with the whole imagination for like a few times, and because the colors were so how can I explain it, but they weren't earthly sort of colors, and there wasn't sort of earthly light in quite a lot of it, so I couldn't actually capture it, and I didn't want to, but I found it a very interesting imagination to just work with, and I did that over a few days, and I also changed it a little bit because I made the tree of life. It just didn't sort of feel quite right, so I made it into a sort of a stream of life, and then I just simply couldn't capture those colors at all on anything, materials. So, but I really enjoyed just trying to live with that picture.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. That was Jessie, by the way. So do remember to say your name beforehand.
Right.
Thanks, Jessie.
That's Ellen here. I worked again with the Elohim one because I wanted to work so that I could really go even slower. So I actually worked with the soft pastel technique that I do with the art therapy, which is working from a white base and building it really, really slowly. So it's a little bit like the wet on dry painting. And even though I still felt that jump when you came into the forms in the earth and the process, it's like there's a little shock, an awakening shock that happens to bring those forms in the earth. It was actually, it was really satisfying building it slowly, and it felt less painful in a way, coming to that jump of having to do those forms. And then I have been working with the other sessions, and I've been doing painting last week on the moon process, and I had this strong urge to actually work with the senses arising as a painting. So I've started doing that and working with that red-blue polarity, and the transformation, coming now to this transformation process that through the colours that sit behind each of them, and that's a really interesting one to be doing that in the wet on dry painting.
Okay. Okay. Ellen's got a couple of people here, by the way, who, like Ellen, who are coming to both this class and the masterclass, which is on Steiner's 9 training sketches. So, yeah, so a very rich experience then, isn't it, for you?
Yeah. Very much.
Yeah. Okay. Anyone else?
I would like to share something.
Yes.
Yes, coming from anthroposophy, I have to say, because I'm not an experienced painter, but I did the motif, the same one, twice later, and it was so interesting knowing about the Elohim created our form, and also they think us, right? And then seeing this picture and the action, which thinking is will, in a way, the two are together there. And it was just fascinating how we were created, or the beginnings.
Yeah.
It very takes you very early, deep back.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just loved it. And I will continue practicing this.
Yeah. So we are, in fact, that's a great segue, Laura, into today's. Of course, we're going into Lemuria. Atlantis, again, we won't be able to have time to really touch on that. I'd like to get quite deeply into the Lemurian one. And that experience that Laura just described is that we are a thought. We are thought by the Elohim. It's very important to hold that picture when we think about how, when one works with art, that the artist, and really has a spiritual experience, but you might rather say, rather than having looks into the spiritual world, rather a spiritual being looks at the artist, and that's where the motif or the imagination or the picture or the gesture comes from. So thanks, Laura, for that. Yeah.
Can I just say about the Elohim, there's still what came out of our last presentation was their work, and how their work is still ongoing. And it really, I had a very wonderful experience just being reminded of that fact, and just walking on the land and wherever, and just the power, this reconnection with this very, very high hierarchy.
Yeah. Another excellent point to that. They are still working. We look at these motifs, and when we read about, the creation or Lemuria, or, even times closer to us, though still very far in the past, we don't realise that the work of the Elohim and the spiritual beings who are engaged in the forming and on working with let's just say the forming and the creation of the earth and of human beings, it's an ongoing process. We're simply looking, when we look at these motifs, we're looking at, you might say, the lifeless image of what happened, of a particular stage of our evolution and our development. And our task in working with these motifs, and this is why I say it's not so important to have technical skills or to say, well, I'm not an art, not being an artist should not be a hindrance to still being able to live into the experience and bringing the experience awake within us. I just want to show you this image here, which is the current ceiling of the Great Hall. It's not a very clear photo. One of the problems, it is actually from a pamphlet that I have, quite an old one. But of course, because in order to see the motifs, you have to have the lights on. The light is always going to make it difficult, unless of course you set it up specially, to actually see the motifs clearly. So I just wanted to show us here, coming in from the west, we have, as we're all now very familiar with, our Elohim and light beings forming the world. Here we have the ear eye, the paradise. This is the ancient Egyptian and the ancient Greek motifs, which we will be looking at next time. And up here, in this great yellow-red part of the rainbow, we have the Lemurian motif. And of all the motifs, you might say that it's the one most dynamic, most almost seemingly chaotic. And it really points to something that we'd like to try and bring in our sketch today, that real quality to show that in this period, which is such a very long time ago, remembering that not only have we got 7 epochs, epochs in this post-Atlantean epochs, but the Atlantean and the Lemurian also had 7 each. So Lemuria is a very, very long way in our past, that the earth and the human being and our whole, it is just almost unimaginable how we lived in that time. So that's just a little bit of the current ceiling in the second Goetheanum. And there, of course, are our motifs from last time. And we saw then that this stage, the Earth was just in its very first stages, in the first few days of the creation, or the days, the macro days as described in the Bible. And I also, just before we go to the Lemurian, I'd just like to go back to this verse that I brought last time. Rilke's word that he you might say created, the Weltinnenraum, or the world inner space, that for him all things from the outer world, you might say, settle within us, and that these motifs, if we bring them awake in us, that they settle into, you might say, our inner space. And we see, when we come to in this motif, that this is from the small cupola, that we see this streaming, this seemingly anything but an ordering, because there's so much movement. But we're really looking here at, you might say, the streaming of the etheric world. It's as it is imprinted, or the Akashic record imprinted into the world ether. And it is a world of tremendous dynamic movement. And certainly in the earlier sketches and motifs, like the one we will be working with today and the Atlantean, that you see still in the motifs, I'm going to work quite specifically with this tremendous dynamic metamorphosis of line, and this tremendous movement. And just here we have the Faust's genius, who we're going to be working with this motif after Easter. And here we have various initiates from the different, here's the Slavic and the Egyptian. And over here, of course, we have the representative of the human being between Lucifer and Ahriman. We also have Lucifer and Ahriman here. And for those who are in my other class, the master class, I just want to draw your attention to the triple moon motif as well here. Just Ellen's point reminding me of that. And For Rilke, just going back to Rilke, he said that most experiences, but particularly art, cannot be expressed through language. And that these motifs then are a kind of experience that have wisdom and, you might say, being and meaning in them that words can't express. And it is our task, like Goethe said, to become at home with them, so that we bring them into our world inner space, of which we as our higher selves, higher sheaths, are part of this continual streaming. I had these sketches up last time and I didn't really talk about them. So this is actually the study of the genius who we just saw in the previous motif up here. And here we have a sketch for the head of the Greek motif. So these are both from the small cupola, which we'll be working with late April and into May, really. And I just want to draw your attention to these forms that we see. So we see these forms are recognisable, and the way they move, to anybody who is familiar with the way water and air in their natural environment, how the forms that they create. So we see this tremendous dynamic movement streaming around this sketch of Faust's genius. In the head of the Greek motif, we have much more a straight line or a more direct streaming, which is perfectly appropriate considering this is actually a sketch for Apollo, and it's, the light of thinking. But again, we don't see repetition, but rather a constant dynamic changing between each one. When then we come to the Lemurian motif, which this drawing, of course, cannot express, since the black line on white paper is possibly the most lifeless way of working. One doesn't see the one-dimensional line just on its own in nature. But of course, for us to work with it, gives us a very clear picture of details. And again, we see, as we saw in the wings, in the Elohim, we see in the wings, again, these dynamic forms. And we're going to practice that a little bit. Michelle last time said, when we were talking about this, I said, well, one does need to practice it. So we are going to practice it together shortly. And what we see here in this motif, which you all received, I hope, is we see up above these great faces, countenances, who are streaming forces down into the world, accompanied by the other spiritual beings who are under their direction. And down below, we have the earth, and we have these prototypes, or these saurian lizards of varying sorts, and who are all walking or moving through what Steiner actually describes the earth as being rather like a spinach-like substance at this time. And we also have these rather bird-dragon, kind of half-bird, half-dragon forms. And what we can't see, but when we go to the colour sketch, and we see a much more enlivened picture, is that between, you might say, heaven and earth, we see what is supposed to be, I know it looks a little bit brown, but these delicate red, soft, streaming, etheric clouds, fire clouds, you might say, that, according to Rudolf Steiner, are the human being in its very early form. The human being as the most of the human being at this point, the soul spiritual part, is in fact out on the periphery, still observing the earth, but there is a kind of a sheath of which these etheric forces are are carrying the human being who Steiner says looks rather at this time like a sort of a fish-bird kind of combination. I mean, this is a very immediately conjures up certain kinds of rather strange images, but it really is just a sheath for containing what is really the human being is more a fire cloud at this point. And then we see here that the spiritual beings are all in blue. The countenances of these great faces are in blue. They stream red forces of life down into the earth, and down below, looking more spinach-like than the other one, we see seaweed-like plant forms beginning to grow. And the the prototypes of animals struggling or very much bound in the gravity of the earth, except for the ones that are flying free here. I'm just going to go on now. This is actually an old sketch of mine which brings the drawing and the pastel together. And what the drawing doesn't show, which I have brought in, is these forms, these etheric streaming forces, rhythmically ordering forces around each of these beings. So they weren't there, and they're not actually sketched out there, and there's only a hint of them there, but I'm really going back to drawing on this understanding of what the etheric, our etheric perception, which is we had etheric perception, sorry, and at this time not physical perception. So this is just a hint of that picture of these streaming forces, and here in the very soft red is the hint of the fire cloud that is the human being. And I just want to go to this completely other sketch that doesn't come from the Goetheanum, but is a watercolour poster design from 1924 for a Eurythmy performance, and this is the Urmensch, the primeval human being, as described by Rudolf Steiner, who was really, we can see a little bit more of this strange, not sort of fish bird, but with what Rudolf Steiner says is just 4 organs that are propelling us, helping us glide through the world of ancient Lemuria. And for those of you who might have dipped into cosmic memory and thought, well, this is a very different description to what was being described in cosmic memory, we are here in the very, very early stages of the Lemurian great time span, really just coming over from the previous great period. So what we're going to do now is we are going to, without too much more ado, we're going to start our drawing exercises. So we need a warm blue, very similar colours to last time, but we don't really need the peach blossom so much. We have the warm blue, we have a red, a warm yellow, a green if you have it. If you don't, then of course we can mix it with the blue and the yellow. Maybe a brown if you have it, but again, we can create that by putting the red over the green, and a little bit of white, which will help us bring a little bit more transparency into the spiritual beings. And as I said, we're going to do a little bit of metamorphic line work first, and I'm going to switch off the slides in a minute so that we do that, and then we'll come back to work with the drawing of the Lemurian motif proper, and I will do once again a picture imagination of it. So I'm going to stop share now, and we're all going to move to our pastels. Yeah. But first of all, we're just going to practice these metamorphic line just to get a little bit of the experience into us. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong camera. Sorry, let's try that again. So we're just going to work with the metamorphic line, and just with, you can do it with pencil, you can do it with charcoal, you can do it with crayon, whatever you've got there. Just so that we get a little bit of a feeling for this. So it's really like just taking a line and then allowing that to follow, you might say, the force pushing through that way. Yeah? Everybody see that?
Sorry, can't see those lines at all. Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you. Lovely.
Yes. Unfortunately, I only have 2 cameras, not 3. It gets a bit awkward. And just try that several times. So it's really, you start a line and then you have to allow that it takes on this life where you have to imagine it. It can feel a little bit strange at first that you have forces. You imagine the formative forces, pushing 2 different directions against. There's another one. Just bring a close up there. We have the 2 different forces here. One pushing one way. So in the first drawing, I just had the force of direction pushing one way. Now I've got in this one the pushing 2 ways. You see how it brings dynamic movement we saw a hint of in the wings. And I'd just like you to practice that for a minute. You need to do it several times to get a sense of it into you. And then what we're going to do is, when we looked at those formation of those wings, we really had that sense of something of a form like that.
Louise has just asked if it's equal forces in both directions.
With the wings?
With the forces.
Yes, but it's different depending on the different, whatever it is you're drawing. So in this one, really, the main dynamic is that direction, and it streams out that way, yeah? So I'm actually drawing something of the wing of the higher beings as we see them in these sketches. Or it may rather look like that. There isn't a fixed form, but what you constantly see is this metamorphosis of line. But nevertheless, each line has a relationship to the previous, but is never identical. And this is, as I said last time, or anybody who was in the World Script sessions that we did last year, this is really in the lines that we see that water leaves on sand. Or when one looks at these images, these frozen images of the currents in the air, then we see this same kind of dynamic qualities. So just keep practicing that for a little bit. It can take time, and then after a while, it almost just feels sort of quite natural to do it. Or the ones that we saw on the head of the Greek initiate that were this much simpler in some ways, streaming. I just went across the other ones, streaming this way. The light forces, which of course we're all more familiar with as something that belongs to the sun. So we are going to begin with the yellow and the red. This great streaming interplay of kind of a fire and air. And then we're going to bring this spinach-like moving, continually transforming itself earth. Then we'll bring in the blue beings and their forces, and we were going to then also bring in this little bit of soft red that is the fire cloud. That's one translation of a word that Steiner uses, that is the human being, and a little bit more that we see there. And one of the things that we don't need to not worry about at all is when things overlap each other, because in the spiritual world, everything overlaps, yeah? All beings overlap each other. So we don't need to worry about keeping them discrete. Or, in fact, it all becoming quite chaotic. Once, as I keep saying, it's really important to try and live into the experience. And I just hope that everybody also isn't, let's say, using too small a piece of paper. I hope you're not using A4 because that's really, really too small. A4 is really too small. Should be at least A3. And you see that I have, in fact, quite a large sheet this time, because when you work, I would actually say this is for anything, painting, almost virtually any kind of artistic work. Certainly in the therapeutic sense, we tend to always want people to work so that it is experienced more in the middle realm rather than it being just a kind of a head realm. And if you work on a piece of paper that is too small, then it's a tendency to sort of work just like this, and you don't really have the same experience than if you work on a bigger piece of paper. No matter how confronting it may be, it is better to work on a bigger sheet so that you can really feel the forces moving in. So what we're going to do now, if everybody is ready, we're going to do the picture imagination, and I will read it twice. So in your mind's eye, red and yellow interpenetrating in a glowing, streaming atmosphere. Above, fire air, the entire earth enveloped in hot steam, whereas down below, earth and metals are flowing like water. Flashes of lightning light up the skies, whirling dragon-like bird animals can be seen darting above, while below, in the dull green shifting earth, reddish seaweed shapes drift around, and lizard-like animals, the prototypes of saurians that are bound to the earth, move sluggishly through this greenish, mud-like substance that is the earth in its continual movement and forming. So below, gravity and density, above, lightning and fire. Then streaming spiritual beings appear on great wings in the regions of fire, and great blue solemn countenances look down upon the earth, bringing protective forces to the gentle red etheric fire clouds that are streaming between heaven and earth, and that these fire clouds are the primeval human being. Just sheaths like fish birds at this point, still without completion. And now we're going to bring that into being. So I'm going to switch webcams again. And we're going to start with our yellow and a tiny bit of red. So we can start with the yellow. Great dynamic streaming movements. It is like, the way yellow likes to move in these great streams of dynamic movement. So we create our world in yellow. First of all, our upper realms. So we have this great yellow space that still has this quality of, it's not completely dense and flat, but has this liveliness in it. My paper is very textured, so it helps me get that quality. Yours is probably not so textured. So you maybe need to be careful, or perhaps you can go back later with white to really keep that yellow feeling like it doesn't become flat and matte. Then we can turn to our red. Coming in from the right, we have great areas of firiness, and I would suggest that you bring them in not in one great movement like we did the yellow, but in a couple of different movements, in keeping with how red likes to work. Because allow the red and yellow to meet and form an orange, of course. And then I would suggest you go back to the yellow to really help get that interpenetration of the two. So we really have, as the description gave, the sense of fire, air. And then return to the red, so that we, especially if you feel that your red has lost a little bit of its redness and gone into orange too much, to red. Now I'm going to turn to the earth and bring in our spinach-like. Again, although we feel immediately this sense of gravity and weight coming into the picture, nevertheless, there's still tremendous sense of movement. Don't want to feel that your earth just sits there like hardened mud, but nevertheless, or solid spinach. Sorry, terrible images here I'm giving you. But it still has that quality, as it said, of this tremendous metamorphosis. In the first session, I think I talked about how we know that form is movement that's come to rest, or it's rather the end of God's path is the physical world. And at this stage on the path, we're very much in the movement and not in the form. So we really want to keep it very much in that sense of, in that sense that it could shift and change any time. And although I'm doing what look like hills or mountains, they are not in any way like the hills and mountains that stay in the one place or only move terribly slowly today. They are great shifting forms. Just allow your green to stream up into the yellow. And of course then you can go back to your yellow and bring it once again, the light down into green. So the sense of all surfaces in interpenetration, all surfaces in movement. Everything in this great state of constant flux and change. And yet, nevertheless, give it some denser, heavier, slower moving areas so that we really feel that gravity. That our animals, who are going to appear in a minute after our plants, will nevertheless feel bound by that gravity. Now we're going to grow some of our plants, or our early prototypes of plants, these seaweed algae-like forms, which you can take a little bit of red and bring now into the green. We just have these plants pushing up out of the great moving earth. It's really like seaweed or something like that. Don't be too worried about them, that their forms. Some plant-like forms. And now we are going to bring in some animals. So you can take a brown, or you can take a red or a different red. It's up to you. I'm going to use a brown just to distinguish it from, give it that sense of weight and gravity that these animals really embodied at this time. And I'm just going to do like a sort of a early dinosaur. It's really like a snake-like form. Great heavy body, snake-like neck, the head. Just these kind of indications of of the kinds of animals. And then of course we also have these dragon-like birds or bird-like dragon forms in the sky. Just a few lines just to give an indication of them. It is in fact a very crowded picture. We're not going to bring all the ones that are in the original sketch. Just giving an indication of them. And then we can also then take maybe a different red, or maybe a pinky red, or maybe the same red, but if you've only got one red, you might want to use a red and a white, and just bring in those very gently, these floating fire cloud, etheric bodies of the human being who is still really, as I said earlier, just more observing from the periphery what is going on down below. If you want to distinguish that from the fieriness, then you could take a little bit of white, as I'm going to do. Let me just make it a little bit more that peach blossom incarnadine colour. Now the exciting part, the great blue faces. I'm going to bring in, I think, two great blue faces. So it's really just like a profile of a face with a bit of and I'm going to use a flat Break that in half, the flat of my pencil. Create, first of all, the forehead, and then the nose, and then the profile, the chin, and then just let that face, the back of that face just stream out. And just need to, now of course it's going green immediately here because it goes over the red, but I will bring more blue. And just use your finger to keep that outline of the profile a little bit clear. Go back and make my blue a little bit stronger. I'm actually going to take a little bit of my black, I've just decided. Sorry, I didn't warn everybody of this, using black in advance, just to give a little bit of, so we can see the eye. This is what happens, you see, is that you, the artist, in the artistic process, you work with what comes as it unfolds, rather than saying, well, there wasn't a black eye in the first one, so I won't put it in. We know, we just really want to have a sense that this great spiritual being is looking down onto the earth and is going to, is my red gone? Going to stream these light forces, and also start to talk about these ego forces down towards our nascent human being. So it's really, if you remember the eye motif, where the force, we saw this, don't have to think of the forces just coming out of the hands. These are coming directly out of the whole, that you might say, the thought of the spiritual being brings about these forces streaming down towards my nascent human being down here. It's just a little fire cloud. And I'm going to create a second face. Again, just a little rounded forehead, the nose, the chin. Just really allow that back of that great face to stream into the colours behind, so that you really do feel that great profile is appearing out of the fire. And then we could turn to our helping spiritual beings, the ones who are under the direction of these great blue countenances, these great faces. And just as we did in the last time with the Elohim, we can start with the head and then bring this movement of that we've just practiced a little bit with the wings below the head. Not just starting with something like that and then allow a line to really come out to form the wings. Of course, it doesn't really matter if the wing goes over the great dark blue face, but nevertheless, just for clarity's sake, since I'm demonstrating, I will just keep that wing a little bit away. Go back and reinforce it, and then bring, as we did with the Elohim, a touch of a little bit of torso and arms, from which are going to also stream forces into the down to the earth. And also, as I did in my other sketch, I'm just going to bring some other movements around to really keep the whole thing together. Bring a second one. And some more forces of life streaming from the beings, that pulses by arms and hands down to continue this light, keep this forming metamorphic, this, to keep everything still in this, we have a sense, as we talked about at the beginning, that the life is happening, the creation is happening, and we're still in that great time where the earth is very plastic and everything is still moving, and we can experience these great formative forces streaming from these spiritual beings. I'd go back and strengthen my human being so that we can still see them in the great chaos that I hope your picture is becoming. And then just to finish off, although in no way would I say this is finished, but nevertheless we have all the key elements down there at the moment. I'm just going to, as I've already done, I have brought some of these movements that we saw in the first Goetheanum in the Snorkel and that we have just worked with, just to really strengthen that. And you can, even if you feel that your pastel has become too dense at this point, then you can use a little bit of white to just bring in that sense of movement. And that's my Lemuria done. So let's just wrap this up so that we have a few minutes to talk about the Atlantean, which you might like to work with in some way over the next 2 weeks. Just going back to the slides. There's my more orderly one from 20 years ago. So we come to the Atlantean sketch, and we still have here these higher beings with we see these dynamic forms that we're calling their wings, and they're still streaming life forces down to the earth. But now we also see animals such that we recognize: the eagle, the bull, and here, where you can hardly see it at all, is the lion on the right-hand side, in what looks like a cave, but shouldn't be thought of as an actual cave, but more encasing this human being who is now much closer to being has moved on a stage. And we see, although you can hardly see these forms here, the same rhythmic forms that we saw in the Elohim, in the higher beings, streaming around here. But up above we have the faces, we have the incarnating human beings who are now gazing more direct, coming closer and closer. So we see them now gazing down to the earth. So this is really still the soul spiritual part of the human being, but we've moved on in our evolution, and might think of this cave-like form as being representing or being something like the physical body. So we're now being contained. And compared to the Lemurian sketch, there is much more order. And we look at the pastels. This is the pastel of the Atlantean epoch. So again, we still have our beings, but this great fiery quality and has disappeared. And rather than it being a great steamy, fiery atmosphere, Rudolf Steiner talks about it being more like a great mist. And that the outline and the human being is still living in this dreamy, unformed, physically not yet fixed form. And we just see in the pastel sketch, we can see the lion much more clearly here, and the eagle and the bull. And we just see, by comparison to the Lemuria, we are living in a world that you might literally say the movement has slowed greatly, but nevertheless is still very malleable, very plastic, very mobile, still with very blurred, you might say, soft outlines. So as we draw this session to a close, next time we will be looking at Old India to Old Greece, which is probably very familiar to everybody, especially those who've worked in Steiner schools. And in the background here, we see the motif that we will be particularly working with is that of the ancient Indian human being. Then we will come to the ERO motif just before Easter, Faust, and just his genius just after Easter. So on either side of Easter, come into the two motifs that really straddle where we are today. There's just some references that I used. This is the reference for the verse for the Rilke poem. And I also drew a little bit on Richter, who wrote Art and Human Consciousness. So once again, just some suggestions. You can get this from the recording. Try the Lemurian sketch again. Take the image into sleep. Or you may like to try, as some people did with the Paradise on their own, work with the Atlantean. There we are. That was Lemuria. And it's right on 5:30. Anybody like to unmute themselves and share a comment or a thought or a question about today?
Yes, I'd like to say thank you. Thank you for that. That was amazing. I really felt like I was remembering something, it was just amazing. Thank you very much for that one.
That was Svetlana, by the way.
Yes, Svetlana, yes.
Thank you, thank you. Well, that's great. That's exactly what I just want to hear. Anyone else?
It's Charlotte here.
Yes, hi, Charlotte.
Your faces and the power of those heads, you've obviously entered very deeply into that depth and strength. That was really, I'm very sort of timid in that area, and I'm very inspired by your strength, Fiona.
Well, I shall also tell you, there's two things to that, Charlotte. One is that I very much always, when I'm working, when I'm teaching with art or when I'm doing it, I live very strongly into it. So it's very, very much, I'm living through it all, which is what I'm trying to help everybody do. So it's not just something we copy outside. But the other thing is a technical thing, Charlotte, and that is that it might be also that my pastels are a very particular kind. They are pastels, and they are already very deep and intense colour, and they're also very expensive. But they give this beautiful glowing colours, and they are it's quite hard to work with them very lightly, especially when you're working, as I was, on Archer's watercolour paper, which is quite textured. So instead of going the like pastels on a flatter paper rubbing into the surface, it tends to sit on top, and so I work both. I both blend them in, and then I leave them unrubbed in on top to add intensity. That's just a technical thing, but that is the schminker, the high quality, the nature of the schminker pastel.
Good. Thanks, Fiona.
Okay, any other quick thoughts? No? Yes? Okay, well, we are just after 5:30, so I will say goodbye and good night, especially to our people in the from the US and Canada, and hope you have a fruitful fortnight before we come back together for our post-Atlantean epochs. Good night, everybody, or good bye.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.